Hello, friends, and welcome back to Working Class Revolt. I'm here with my co-host, David Fox, longtime union organizer in Australia. We have a special guest tonight, journalist, author, Caleb Maupin. How are we tonight, gentlemen?
Fantastic. After a long 10 days, I'm feeling fantastic.
I'm having a good evening myself as well.
Right on, right on. So I understand, David, we have a victory for the working class folks over there in Australia.
Yes.
I'll let you take it away. I got a graphic you sent me, and I'll go ahead and pull that up.
Right. There we are.
Two of us will get off.
Okay. Well, first of all, we just had a recent win against Lactalis. Just for those of you who are wondering what Lactalis is, it's a French multinational dairy company. Over here in Australia, they're involved in the manufacture of dairy products such as Paul's ice cream, Paul's milk, custards, flavoured milk, etc. We've been in negotiations for a few months now, and obviously it came to a critical point about 2 or 3 weeks ago in relation to a few key demands that we certainly wanted in the agreement. Obviously, one of the big ticket items for the production workers was paid meal breaks because they work a continual type roster, and obviously they've had to work during their meal breaks, etc., not being paid for it. Well, obviously that was a huge win for them. Besides the pay increases as well, which was huge for us because in the last 3 or 4 years in Australia, we've had a lot of stagnation in our wages as well. So we've broken out of that stagnation, and I believe that's starting to spread right across the industries we're involved in. Now, there were 3 unions involved: the United Workers Union, which predominantly looks after the production. The union I'm involved in, the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union, which looked after the maintenance fitters, and the Electrical Trades Union, which looked after electricians. And they see that photo there. There's the picture of myself along with the State Secretary, the Assistant State Secretary, and the members in front of Scabby the Rat. It's quite legendary here in Victoria. We use these inflatable figurines for various picket lines that have been going on for some time. There's 2 other figurines we use as Fat Cat and also Greedy Pig. They came from the US. There's a manufacturer in the US that makes them, and I believe unions use them over there. But most important thing, so it was a good 10% increase over 3 years, and employment security issues as well, such as casual conversion to full-time. It's vitally important. We've got a highly casualised workforce, and it was a step in the right direction about converting those casuals to full-time work so they can gain greater job security, and also having sick leave, annual leave, etc. And another important one, it might not be so important for people, but when there is a dispute with the company, we have a status quo provisions in our agreements or contracts. That spares if they want to change shifts or make a change, well, the status quo shall remain until the dispute is over. Now, the workers themselves took protected action. It took up to 10 days outside the plant there in Bendigo. Now, the Lactalis plant in Bendigo is one of the lowest paid of all throughout Australia. It's obviously, we gained a lot of support very quickly from other unions and very respective state branches, both internationally and locally and on the national level. And the IUF, which is the international body of all the food unions, they're involved in food, tobacco, beverage production. They garnered a lot of support from France as well. It's interesting because IUF has actually looked at a lot of extensive research on Lactalis, just how big they are. They're owned by the Besnier family there in France. They live in a lovely chateau. They own 180 plants right through Europe. I believe they own plants in the US as well and Canada. They're no small player in the whole dairy business. They're not just own a few little plants around the world. They are quite a big conglomerate. So what was vitally important out of this, besides winning a lot of key claims as well, this site hasn't had a dispute on it for over 33 years. So a lot of people for the last 10 years, after being let down a lot by the company promising all major investment jobs and that, I think they had enough. And by the out of that, it actually brought the whole site together. There was no rivalry between work groups anymore, between maintenance and production. It brought everyone together. And I think the important thing is what solidarity, worker solidarity, this is what they are able to achieve. It might be a wages and conditions issue, but it's still a form of class struggle. And what we're seeing is what you're actually able to achieve through unity in action. And if we all agree on some points, and this is it's fantastic, and it's a great confidence booster for them as well on the ground. It's good to go in and win a dispute like this because, you know, going in there, no one's divided, everyone's going back united. No one's bitter about things at all. And next time in the next 2 years, 2-3 years, when the next time around we start negotiations, we're a lot more united, unity on the ground, but also a lot more confidence in to actually start working higher levels of struggle as well. And I think that's vitally important when I've explained about the reason why it's important about being involved in union struggle, because it's actually, this is right at the coalface. And actually, another thing I was talking about, a mentor of mine on the phone this morning, he congratulated me, but what he correctly pointed out, when we've got the ability to withdraw our labour, we're depriving the capitalists of surplus value, because without workers, surplus value doesn't get created. And it's interesting when people talk about automation and universal basic income and that. So that's great, but where's all the surplus value going to be created and no one's working? And so high unemployment. So it's certainly it's a good one to learn that for workers for our labour power. And it's a basic thing that we withdraw it. That's actually crippled the capitalist. So it's one form of struggle, along with the political and ideological struggles that we need to engage in. So for me personally, besides being sunburnt, that's why I'm red as a beetroot, similar to you, Caleb. I've actually gingered as well. So this is what you look like when you get older. You get a salt and pepper beard, but you still go red. I've got very fair skin, as you can see. So yeah, I'll go red. I don't. So
right on.
Anyway,
right on, comrade.
Yeah.
I'm very.
Everyone's happy about it. It was a good win for all and for the community as well. I think it's a great tick for us.
A victory for one worker is a victory for all workers, and we're very happy to hear. Any response, Caleb?
No, I just think it's very inspiring. And that whenever a victory like this is won, I mean, that's people need to hear about it, right? Because a lot of people think there's no point in struggling, and no point in going out and doing any of this. You can't win, you can't do anything. So every time there's a victory, we ought to celebrate it and scream it from the heavens. And it's great to see, you know, people from different industries coming together. And, you know, in the United States, they actually have a law, the Taft-Hartley law, that makes what they call solidarity strikes illegal. That you can only strike over conditions in your own workplace. That was to prevent, you know, this kind of solidarity from happening. So it's great to see that people are standing arm in arm.
Right on. So I guess we'll go into the news portion of the show. Let's see. The first news item we have, a lot of people are talking about Mike Pompeo. We're not sure if it was jokingly or directly stated that they will smoothly go into a second Trump term. And just so this isn't flagged as fake news by the Silicon folks, Biden has won the election. Somebody in the Trump administration has said they will go into a smooth transition to a second Trump term. And it's absolutely ridiculous. But what I'm seeing on the ground in my activism is forces in the RCP and other left forces are actively hyping like this is the coup, this is the end of the world. And then even forces that are Democrats are like, shut up about this already. Don't you realize that overhyping this is just making the clamp down on progressives harder? This is making it so that it will enable them to put these horrible people in the upcoming administration. Any thoughts on this, guys?
Well, I mean, I'm careful that I wouldn't put it past the faction of the ruling class that is behind Biden to steal the election. I'm just not convinced. I haven't seen any evidence that shows that whatever fraud or malfeasance went on was enough to actually, make it, swing from Trump to Biden. I mean, we're talking about 5 million votes, and forging 5 million votes is not a small task, right? And that a computer glitch in Michigan, dead person voting in New York, that's not enough to show that there was actually election fraud enough. So while I don't put it past elements in our ruling class, and I know that like Silicon Valley, by outlawing stories that were critical of Biden and such, was certainly pulling for Biden. At the same time, I just don't see I don't see it, and I feel like Trump is a negotiator, and he is probably negotiating the terms of his leaving office. He's saying I can leave office in a very painful manner, or I can leave office very, very quietly. And I think that he doesn't want to be prosecuted when he leaves office, number one. I think he also wants to keep some of the cozy deals that he made for his businesses while the president intact, and make sure they stay intact into the Biden administration. So I think that's what's going on here. I will say, though, they did have a massive rally in Washington, D.C. today. I mean, thousands and thousands of Trump supporters came out. And there was a left-wing protest against it. But I mean, this was much bigger than any Trump mobilization we've seen in the past. So Trump will leave office, I predict, with a mass base of supporters who will believe that it was a rigged election, that he's the rightful president. And that'll make it even more dangerous if Biden takes office and is a huge disappointment to everybody. Because Trump will come out of this very, very strong. And if Biden doesn't do anything progressive and doesn't address some of the big problems in the country right now, the only place that people are going to go is toward Trump. And that the attacks on AOC right now, and the fact that Democrats, I mean, the election just ended, and they're already going after Bernie Sanders and Ilhan Omar and Ocasio-Cortez and saying they're too far left and they damaged the party. And it's like, goodness gracious, like, if anything, it's having these moderates like Joe Biden that don't excite anybody. It's damaging the Democratic Party. So that's pretty horrifying for me to watch. But I don't think that Trump has enough support within the ruling class, within the military, within the intelligence agencies to really stay in office. I mean, for him to really pull off like a coup or something, he would need to have a lot of support from a lot of the right people, and he doesn't have that. Mike Pompeo, from what I understand, was kind of making a joke. Even he actually kind of said it like humorously, like he was kind of winking as he said it, like it was almost a joke. My prediction is Trump will leave office, but I feel like there are probably forces within the ruling class that are watching Trump right now very closely and saying, what is Trump doing wrong? Now, what if Trump had done this? What if Trump had done that? And I think that, that this is leading American politics in the direction where we could have some kind of military coup at some point. We could have a more straight up autocratic state at some point if they felt it was necessary. And if the autocrat and the faction that was calling for some kind of autocracy really had enough support within the apparatus of the government. And that's very disconcerting. And this is all kind of psyching the population up for something that could actually lead to the nightmare the RCP is expressing.
Any comments, David?
Well, look, the result of the US elections, I suppose, are not surprising. It was, to me, it was going to be pretty close either way, Trump or Biden. It wasn't going to be an absolute landslide for neither of them as well. Because a lot of people either switched camp or even went to alternative candidates such as the Greens or Libertarians or other respective independents. It'd be interesting how many people didn't vote either. They just were disillusioned with the whole process. In regards to voter fraud, well, look, I mean, no system's perfect. Sure, there was, but it wasn't anything enough. And you correctly pointed out, it wasn't anything significant to actually move either candidate over the line as well. To mobilise that amount of people takes a lot of work and effort, and without actually being found out either. So, if you want to organise 5 million people, you'd be found out by the respective authorities very quickly. There would be no escape from it. So, look, it happens in this country too. Some people register people in different names and, stack votes in branches and of respective parties. It happens. Is it right? No, it certainly isn't. I mean, it's wrong. It would be one person, one vote, sure. But I think to actually make up the whole myth of voter fraud and against Trump, or someone stole the election. No, I think the population made their mind up. They just didn't want Trump. They don't love Biden. I just think people wanted to get rid of Trump. That's all it was. Nothing that, and they really had no. And Biden, unfortunately, was the one I had to go with. I think they were just desperate to get Trump out of office. That's what it comes down to. I mean, Trump, as correctly pointed out, is stupid evil. Is he obnoxious? Yeah. Is he foul? Yes. All those things. That's basically what he is. He's a buffoon from a mile away, and he's quite incompetent as well. But the fact is, you're right. There's all the sharks that were behind him and now behind Biden, and obviously. What my concern is now the Pentagon, the military now, the war hawks, all them are now becoming precedent again. What the big concern is now, what's next? I'm not concerned about how Trump leaves office. I'm more concerned what's next now, what the war machine will be up to, who's going to be attacked, who's going to be reinvaded, which we'll be talking about very soon as well. So.
That's a good transition. I understand there was some news about war crimes committed by Australia recently. Yes. Can you tell us more about that, David?
Right. Well, just to bring this up, in the early 2000s, it was after 9/11. Australia, along with the US, invaded Afghanistan. We had our elite soldiers, Special Air Services, otherwise known as the SAS, and the commandos involved in it, and other medical units as well, along with the US, and other forces such as the Dutch and British as well involved in it at the same time. We've obviously, there was rallies here in Australia as well, and obviously also to the war in Iraq a bit later on, where we had over 500,000 people in Sydney, just shut the whole city down. Was when the invasion was.
He's frozen for a minute. I'll bring him right back.
People, though, have also evolved a lot of the myth about the Aussie soldier, the Aussie digger. We wouldn't do a thing like that. Well, lo and behold, it has. Now, there's about 12 suspected cases of either non-combatants, or they call them civilians, or prisoners of war being shot by both SAS and commandos. There is an investigation happening. It was leaked around the last 3 years to the Australian Broadcasting Commission in a sense where when it was leaked last year, there was raids by the Australian Federal Police on the ABC about who leaked it. The records, I believe, and I think a lot of people would suspect that there was a government cover-up. They wanted to cover this up altogether because they know this was going to be explosive. And I'm not going to say if there was or any more criminal acts. War crimes, I wouldn't be surprised. I can't really make that accusation, but even a lot of new media is saying now that's not surprising. There's many more cases as well. So everyone tends to want to go, oh, well, yeah, we'd expect that with US soldiers, similar to what happened with Iraq or others. Oh, it wouldn't be Australian soldiers, but lo and behold, it's now coming home to roost. And it's quite horrific, just how just blatant it was and how they tried to cover up. And also to the culture within a lot of our elite military units, and that it's very you could say it's a hotbed of fascism if you'd like to, and some of them were taken. I don't know if you saw it in the US, but there are pictures of our Australian troops carrying swastikas and even Confederate flags as well, flying that, and there was mass public condemnation about that, and it was quite correctly pointed out that the Confederate flag has nothing to do with Australia at all. It's with the US. So, but this is some of the mindset. I'm not saying that every soldier's like that out there. So I don't think a lot of people do enter the military on good intentions. They want to think they're serving, they're doing something good for the community and for their country. But when they're caught into a situation like that, anything could happen very quickly. So it's going to be an ongoing investigation. Scott Morrison, our Prime Minister, came out. He's now appointing people to lead the investigation into it. But I think bit by bit there's going to be a lot more unveiling of what's been really going on over there as well. It'd be really shocking for the community as well here in Australia. So just watch this space at the moment. I was just saying, before I was just reading through the Age. I picked that up on Friday. I don't know if you could see it, but yeah, this SAS Soldiers Faced First War Crimes Investigation. They were big stories within the respective newspapers about and media outlets.
Right on. I prompted David to. I saw that in the news, and I wanted to hear about it. I found a story from the country where my comrade and I was going to be broadcasting from, and I actually wanted to take this opportunity to highlight a little bit of cultural elements in the United States. This album here, Sturgill Simpson's A Sailor's Guide to Earth, is an anti-war country album, and it's from a Navy veteran. And people, if you go on YouTube, the lyrics are wrong, but if you look at the liner notes, it has the correct lyrics. And I just wanted to sing a cappella a section of one of my favorites. It goes like this: Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Iran. North Korea, tell me, where does it end? The bodies keep piling up every day. How many more are they gonna send? They send our sons and daughters off to die for some oil and to control the heroin. So the last line there, they send our sons and our daughters off to die for some oil and to control the heroin. And I used to when I was in high school, I used to really hate country music. I used to think, oh, that's some dumb redneck stuff. I don't want nothing to do with that. And I used to love to listen to NPR. And I always thought, well, they talk. I don't know. I got to refresh my camera right quick. They have such a good vocabulary on NPR, and they sound like they're more inclusive and stuff. And then I was listening on the radio earlier this week, and I turned it on, and NPR's like, we're worried about Trump messing up our national security. And I'm like, what do they mean they're worried about Trump messing up the national security? They're worried that Trump is going to take troops out of Afghanistan. And that I'm just getting at that working class people, progressive culture and progressive working class culture and understanding is a place that we can come from. And these media controlled institutions, regardless of how they sound and how progressive or what they say they're about, are in complete control of the imperialist establishment. And we can find progressive anti-war sentiments within the people. I know, Caleb, on your talk on Friday, you did a good section on Afghanistan, including the links to, as the country artist Sturgill Simpson, links to the heroin production in Afghanistan.
Right. Well, Afghanistan, if you look at it, if you look at a map, it's right in between three of the major geopolitical rivals of American imperialism. Right. You've got Russia right north of it, west of it or east of it, you have Iran, and then west of it, you have China. Right. And it's right in the middle. And ever since the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, Afghanistan has been just a bastion of instability and chaos. And it has become the center of the global heroin trade. And there's also been a number of terrorist and extremist groups that have been based there. And if the purpose of the U.S. occupation was to bring stability to Afghanistan, it has done the exact opposite. Ever since the United States has been there, it has been unstable. And that instability has caused a lot of heroin to flow into China, into Iran, and into Russia, and a lot of terrorist groups to flow into Russia and to Iran and into China. I think that is the purpose of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan. It is to keep Afghanistan unstable. Strategic. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the big Cold War strategist, he argued that Eurasia is the grand chessboard. That's what he called it. And if you can control the heart of Eurasia, you can control the world. And he wrote a whole book after the fall of the Soviet Union, basically saying that even though the Soviet Union is gone, the USA needs to maintain strategic control of Central Asia and Russia and China and that area if they want to rule the world. And that Hitler had a similar theory. He called it the heartland, you know, and the heartland, that's why he wanted to conquer Russia. If you can control the heartland, you can control the world. And that I think that that is what the United States is doing in Afghanistan. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that, you know, NPR, they were doing this whole thing about they're worried about Donald Trump is going to pull the troops out of Afghanistan before he leaves office, as if that would somehow be a bad thing, right? And that Trump said he was going to pull the troops out of Afghanistan, and then he changed his mind, and then he said he was going to do it again, and then he changed his mind, and that many people are expecting that, like, as Trump leaves office, to just do something popular that will be popular. People want U.S. troops out of Afghanistan, but something that you know the government apparatus wouldn't really approve of is that Trump will, like, make a dramatic move and pull the troops out. And to argue that Trump shouldn't do that, NPR ran this story where they interviewed an Afghan women's soccer team. And it was all about how if it weren't for the U.S. troops being in Afghanistan, these people in Afghanistan would never have a women's soccer team. And that's why we're in Afghanistan, to protect women so they can have a soccer team. But when you look at it, and when you look at the actual facts of the situation, right, women's rights were on the march in Afghanistan during the 1970s. And when the People's Democratic Republic of Afghanistan was set up, you know, women's rights were at their height, and the Soviet Union, not only were they enabling women to take roles in the government, not only did they have literacy campaigns, but you know, the Soviet Union reforested Afghanistan because the British Empire had gone into Afghanistan in the 1800s and just deforested the place. Afghanistan has some very rare forms of wood that you don't get, like rare timber that you don't get in other parts of the world. It has a very unique climate, and the British had just completely destroyed their forests. So you know, the Soviet Union was there reforesting Afghanistan, and the Soviet Union was actually setting up, like, farming so that Afghanistan could have more, like, efficient agriculture. And you know, the Soviet Union sent soldiers to Afghanistan because of the fact that the United States had backed Osama bin Laden and al-Zarqawi and all kinds of extremists and terrorists from Saudi Arabia to go in there and launch an insurgency. And the United States reduced Afghanistan to civil war in the 1980s, at a time when women's rights were on the march in Afghanistan, reduced Afghanistan to civil war, and brought into power the forces that eventually became the Taliban. But then the Taliban started to become independent. And in the 90s, the Taliban actually was winning awards from the United Nations for all the work they were doing to get rid of the heroin trade. Like, the Taliban was, like, wiping out the heroin dealers. And then after the U.S. invasion, all of a sudden the heroin trade expanded. And even now, you know, this NPR story would give you the impression that the USA is protecting these women's soccer players. But people say that the situation for Afghan women has gotten worse since the U.S. invasion, right? With the rise of terrorist groups and extremist groups, with the instability, you know, the danger of violence that women face in their everyday life, and all of that is actually worse. So this notion that the USA is occupying Afghanistan to protect the women is just ludicrous. It's just completely outrageous. But that's what NPR is saying, and that's the fear, is that Donald Trump might pull the troops out, which is what the U.S. public wants. It's what the Afghan people want. You know, it's what even a lot of members of the U.S. military want. So, you know, but this is not what international capitalism wants. It's not what the big multinational corporations and the military industrial complex wants. And that's the situation. It's rather disturbing. One thing that David talked about, he talked about some of the fascist atmosphere in Afghanistan among the soldiers. It's interesting. There was some you know, revelations about, like, there was a division of U.S. troops in Afghanistan that were using the symbol of the SS, of Hitler's SS, their symbol. And there was also a lot of videos circulating of U.S. troops who would urinate on the corpses of people they killed, and, like, photograph themselves and doing that. And so, you know, a lot of that very ugly mindset that comes with occupying a country is there. There's actually a woman, I won't say her name, but she went to high school with me. And she's in Afghanistan. She was in Afghanistan 2 or 3 years ago and was on Facebook. And I was reading her posts, and she was absolutely miserable and didn't want to be there. And she was just, you know, she was working at a base in Afghanistan, and she was on social media. And this is someone I went to school with. And she's just saying, this is unbelievable. I hate being here. The people here don't want me here. I don't want to be here. This is absolutely miserable. Joining the U.S. military was the worst decision I ever made. I wish I could leave today. I mean, she was just not holding back, you know, just every day with these tirades about how miserable she was in Afghanistan. This is somebody I went to school with. This isn't, you know, some, like, account someone's pointing me toward or something that could be a hoax. This is somebody I knew quite well when I was in high school. and she was my Facebook friend, and she was miserable. So yeah, I mean, I think that that's the reason the United States is there. As far as the lithium issue, a lot of people raise the lithium issue, and that may be a reason that the United States is continuing its presence there. But I think the issue is that they don't want China to start accessing that lithium, because right now the United States is not really accessing the lithium, right? They're not really, it's there, they know it's there. I think their fear is that if U.S. troops leave, China will move in and start accessing the lithium, because at this point, China is trying its hardest to stabilize Afghanistan. They don't want the heroin to flow over their border. They don't want the terrorist groups that are operating in the Uyghur regions to have base areas in Afghanistan and come over the border. And China and Iran have a plan for Afghanistan of, they call it trade and transport, and they're planning to build like railway to give Afghanistan not only access to both Iran and China, but also to give it access to the ocean, so they can start having factories there that would export products and such, and that would like lay the basis for an actual economy in Afghanistan, so people aren't getting involved in the drugs and the terrorist groups. And that's what China wants to do. And China actually has a program where people in Afghanistan who are injured get flown over the border into China to get medical care. And that's made China very popular. And if the USA were to pull out, China could then, start developing Afghanistan, start building some more of the railways. And on top of that, could then start using the lithium, because that lithium is very important in telecommunications. And what's the major corporation the USA hates right now? Huawei Technologies, the world's biggest telecommunications manufacturer. Right. So if U.S. troops were out of there and China were able to start developing Afghanistan in cooperation with Iran, and they could get some of that lithium, and then they could start using that for Huawei Technologies, that's a nightmare. Like, the United States doesn't want peace in Afghanistan. It doesn't want stability in Afghanistan. It wants instability, and I think that's the really important thing there. A lot of people will look at Afghanistan and say the USA failed. I think that this is exactly what Wall Street wants. They want an impoverished, unstable, divided, drug-infested, terrorist-infested Afghanistan, and that's what they're getting. And I think that's not good for Afghanistan. It's not good for the world. It's not good for anybody.
Yep.
Right on. Let's see, next news item. I mentioned earlier that the fear of Trump is really enabling Biden and the Democrats to put a crackdown on more progressive voices in their party. My position is more of a hardline issue. I call them sheepdogs. The enemy apparatus, the enemy parties, simply dividing the country and putting their and there you go, you're still there, and putting their political energy. My understanding is the two enemy parties, the parties of the bourgeoisie, are solely there to manipulate the people in a direction to control their political power, so no concessions happen for the working class. No universal health care, no minimum wage, any actual concession that would give material advancements, education to the working class is taken off the table. And one of the ways they do this, they prop up folks, they hype up folks like Trump, and they say, well, if you don't vote for Biden, you're going to get Trump. So there's been, I think there was one Democratic congresswoman who was basically blaming the close election on the more progressive elements. And just recently, if you look at Biden's cabinet positions, his cabinet, who he got for the cabinet positions, none of it includes the squad or Bernie Sanders. It's all Republicans. It's all neocon hawks, warmongers. Kamala Harris, I think it was five members of the Bush administration are backing her campaign as if this was a good thing during the debates. One of the recent transition appointments, the lead advisor on immigration that was appointed by the future Biden regime, Cecilia Muniz, is topic immigration advisor. Cecilia Muniz was the person that defended Barack Obama's mass deportation, including the very sensitive deportation of thousands of unaccompanied minors. She carried this out and defended it. And a lot of the same people. It gets really bad. And it was the Chicano Raza vote in Aztlán, in the Southwest, Arizona, Nevada. It was their vote that won these states for Biden. You had immigrants' rights activists out there in the streets going, maybe not door to door, but whatever they had to do, they did to get that racist Trump out of office. They just put into power somebody who has openly defended the U.S. regime deporting children, separating families. I mean, this is a travesty. Any thoughts on that, comrades?
Well, it's interesting you pointing out that the two parties. John Pilger actually correctly pointed something out one time. They actually, all our respective countries, we're actually a one-party state with two factions arguing who's going to control the capital, manage the capitalist system, and that's basically what we're seeing playing out now there as well. And I think the big concern there is, look, these Republicans are supporting the Democrats. It's like they all of a sudden went to bed Republican one night and woke up in the morning Democrat, and they saw the light. Oh, yes, what we did was evil. We're going to have a complete change of society. Didn't do that at all. What they're seeing as well, that people like Trump and his ilk around them, they're basically a threat to that sort of traditional establishment. I think you believe it was the Eastern establishment, the oil bankers, the rural super wealthy. And he wasn't doing as he was instructed and managing on behalf of their system. In fact, he was going flying right into their face, so he had to go. But just on Trump, it was just something interesting, because I do know a few other people in America that once voted for him back in 2016. I was always curious, what did they see in him? Because they said the one thing he did was listen to us. He finally heard what we were talking about for years, about losing all our manufacturing, our security and everything else. And they saw the Democrats and everyone else of the Washington establishment, and that's selling the whole country out with free trade agreements. And I saw this here, same thing with Australia. All virtually manufacturing factories closing it. Next thing, all the equipment being put on trucks sent down to the port and shipped overseas, and basically left us with unemployment. So that resonated as well. It's not because they thought Trump was this wonderful person. The Republicans were a wonderful party, but they just thought there was no choice. This guy's standard, and that's what we're seeing as well. Democrats are going to be sinister, of course they will be. They're not. There's no. I think a lot of people don't understand. There's no good guy, bad guy in this. They're all servants to the capitalist system, and if they're not going to serve the capitalist class, well, then they're booted out of office pretty quickly.
Caleb?
Well, I mean, I think that it's interesting that, Joe Biden has just appointed this deporter. When, you'll remember on the campaign trail, he said that when he takes office, there will be only the deportation of violent criminals, and anybody else, you're in the country illegally or whatever, pathway to citizenship. He said only violent criminals will get deported. Let's see what he actually does. I'm curious about that. The other thing is that, we talk about the divisions in the ruling class. You notice how desperate Joe Biden was to get the support of frackers during the election? He kept reassuring everyone, I'm not going to outlaw fracking. And it was like, the frackers are backers of Trump, right? PragerU, the YouTube channel, is paid for with fracking money. And they're like right-wing Trump supporters. And that, Turning Points USA is backed by fracking companies. And the fracking companies are very right-wing. They were the main funders of the Tea Party protest against Obama. But, I think that Joe Biden was just desperate that if he could just convince a few of them to back him, then he would be safe. And I think that's particularly interesting. And that the fracking companies, they're almost out of business now. I mean, the pandemic did them in, right? I mean, the oil prices, they couldn't get them high enough. Under Obama, the oil prices just sunk. But Trump kept trying to get the oil prices higher. He got them to around $50 a barrel. That wasn't really enough. And now this pandemic has just sunk the oil prices. And that is like frackers, their money is like drying up. And if you add to the fact that fracking is already more expensive, in terms of per barrel, like the profit margin per barrel is much lower than like drilling or something like that. So I don't know how much of a fracking industry we're going to have in the United States pretty soon. Trump continues to brag that he says that he made the United States the greatest energy producer. Well, that actually happened under Obama, and it's because of fracking, right? Fracking has made the United States the greatest oil and natural gas producer in history, but that's because of fracking. But there is a division. There's very clearly a division in the ruling class right now. And the fact that Biden was so desperate to get the support of frackers and was really just, I mean, bending over backwards to try and get their support shows that the faction behind Trump isn't as weak as you might think. You know, it really isn't as weak as you might think. And that indicates that there was a real desire among the Harris-Biden campaign to build as much of a consensus within the ruling class as it possibly could. Because that Trump base, that insurgent wing of American capital, is quite strong, right? I mean, that's pretty clear. The fact that even now Trump is, you know, contesting the election. I don't think he has enough support to stay in office, but there is a very, very strong layer of the ruling class that is insurgent against the Eastern establishment, and that I think that that at this point, you know, it's interesting because you have voices like Andrew Yang talking about universal basic income. And you have, you know, voices like AOC and Bernie that are talking about national health care and things like that. And then I think there are probably sections of the ultra rich that think that that's more strategic, right? That if we could give people that, this would calm things down. Because, you know, what happened with Black Lives Matter and the social explosion that happened, I mean, that is something that, you know, bigger and more explosive things could be happening very soon. And that, you know, that some kind of, you know, working class insurrection is very, very likely to break out pretty soon. And I think there's a big fear on the part of the ruling class that if they don't find a way to stabilize the country, things are just going to blow. And they know that. But yet there is this fear of the left wing of their own party. It's very bizarre. While you know, the left wing of their own party probably offers solutions that might lead to more stability, they also just don't like any basic anti-capitalist thinking. They don't like any class struggle rhetoric to be introduced. And they're very afraid of Bernie Sanders and Andrew Yang. They were vicious to Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, my goodness, you know. And so it's very, 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 very complicated in terms of the Democratic Party at this point doesn't even know what it stands for. It's almost becoming more and more just kind of the party of the status quo and the establishment with the central elements. And so you almost wonder if at some point there might be some kind of weird electoral alliance between the Bernie Sanders element and the Trump element, because they're both kind of aimed at the same establishment, and that could be very, very weird how things develop. But you know, people talk a lot about how the Republican Party started out as a revolutionary left-wing party that was opposed to slavery. Well, now it's the conservative right-wing party. The Democrats were the party of Jim Crow segregation and the party of the slaveholders, but now they're the left-wing party. And we might be entering a period where there's some kind of weird realignment in American politics because the Democrats are becoming more and more just the ruling establishment party. They got the neoconservatives backing them in this election. Meanwhile, you see some strange things happening where there are elements that are generally on the left that are just not on board with the censorship that Silicon Valley is doing, and so politics in the United States might be entering a weird shift. But we will just have to see. Big shifts like that tend to take a long time to happen. They don't happen overnight. So we shall see what happens.
Any additional news items, David?
Well, it's interesting back here in Australia with regards to the US elections, the response our government came about, and including the opposition as well. The Prime Minister was very quiet during the time the vote was counted, and as soon as Biden was announced, straight on the phone, congratulating, hello, and all this. And I did make comment to someone the other 2 weeks ago. I mentioned they're keeping quiet because he doesn't want to all of a sudden congratulate one person, found out the other person's won. That'd be in all sorts of trouble. And so they've kept it very quiet. I can see our federal ministers, our foreign minister, etc., just keeping very quiet, and then obviously they went straight on the phone as soon as it was onto it. And same with our opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, who's the federal opposition leader for the Labor Party. Same thing, and they're obviously now all praising Biden, you know, talking about stability, bringing it back to the centre, where Trump's now starting to be ignored. I've noticed that too, the media, even Fox media, the Murdoch media is starting to cut him off as well completely. So Trump's finding himself further and further isolated within ruling circles. So once Murdoch sort of gives you turns against you, know full well you should know full well that he's gone completely. So all this, it was what you call the liberal media, such as The Age, I've got here, or Guardian, etc. All of a sudden, oh, Biden, yes, stability, and it's like this I couldn't believe it. It's just like they all got the sense of relief. Oh, he's in. Great. Now it's all cheerio. What's your orders, sir? What would you like us to do next? And even with world leaders around from European leaders, Germany, Boris Johnson in the UK, they're talking about how it's all going to be in this whole new relations building. But what was interesting too, two of our former prime ministers, Malcolm Turnbull and Kevin Rudd, they're actually pointing about, they're talking about, telling China they must, the US can play the central role now enforcing the rules. There's the rule of the economic order, and force China to abide by the rules and this whole court, and they just let it slip basically, but the whole order of things. It's like, we're back in the running race, guys. The US leading the charge. We're all going along. We're back in the race. Trump stuffed it up, but we're back in. You could just see that right through the ruling class overall, and you could see that's what was being said here. If you could read through the lines, basically it was right. Now we can be how we're going to effectively deal with China, Russia, Iran, etc. So, and which is actually the concern because the war hawks is now starting to gather again and start to circle.
Did folks see that AMLO, the president of Mexico, did not congratulate Biden? Did you see that? That he's not.
No. That's great. I didn't hear that.
Yeah, he said that he's not sure that Biden actually won the election, and he knows about voter fraud, and he's actually saying that Trump might be right, which is kind of shocking. But I think that points to the difference because AMLO is a leftist, right? I mean, the communist, the Labor Party of Mexico is in his coalition, the PT. And that his organization, his coalition is left wing. He's a social democrat and an anti-imperialist. But he probably wouldn't have been able to take office if Trump hadn't been elected, right? Because he was elected 2 times, but the election was rigged against him basically by the United States and by pro-U.S. forces in Mexico. But after Trump got in, and Trump had this position that was very, very hostile to Mexico, and he's going to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it, things shifted in Mexico into AMLO's favor, and AMLO was actually able to take office. And then AMLO renegotiated NAFTA with Trump and got some favorable things for Mexico, like some fair wage zones and such. And so in a way, I think AMLO feels that Trump is better for Mexico than Joe Biden might be. That Joe Biden with a more, quote unquote, globalist outlook might be worse for Mexico, might be more in favor of the free trade international policies that AMLO fought against. I think that's an interesting dynamic, and it points to how everything doesn't always completely line up the way people see it in the United States. So I think that's pretty wild. Though at the same time, though, I do think that that a Biden administration will be more, or I guess less hostile to Maduro, less hostile to the government of Bolivia and Nicaragua than Trump. That Trump was really, really desperate to get the support of the Miami Cuban folks, and he needed to just constantly be proving to them how opposed he was to Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua. Whereas I think that Joe Biden realizes that crowd, that Miami crowd, is never going to vote for him anyway. And so that Joe Biden, on some level, might be more open to some kind of trade deal or something with Cuba. It was under the Obama administration that the USA finally did recognize Cuba and give diplomatic relations. So, with Latin America, it's a little bit mixed.
That led to an interesting point that I saw in the election results. You talked about the gusanos in Florida. Probably not the best term to use, but that's how I say it. But basically, from my understanding, Trump won Florida, but also a $15 minimum wage passed in Florida, which means there was Republicans, or at least people who voted Trump, that were also in favor of the $15 minimum wage, which goes along with my point that, and the Green Party says this, the Movement for a People's Party says this, these policies of raising the minimum wage, universal health care, these are popular positions, and neither party seems to be able to pass them. When it comes time, when they're in office, and it's time to do what's right for the people, they do what's right for their donors.
Well, it's interesting. I don't know if folks remember back in 2006 when there was a huge sweep for the Democrats in Congress, where they took back the Senate, and they, it was during the Bush years, but they took control of the Senate, they took control of the House of Representatives, and part of the way they did it was in all the key states, they had a raise the minimum wage initiative on the ballot, and they discovered that one way to get low income people who are making minimum wage to vote is to go vote themselves a raise, right? Because if you're it's going to go vote on whether or not you get a raise, people will go vote and vote themselves a raise. And it was almost, people said it was the Democrats' response to what the Republicans had done. The way Republicans had gotten people in their base who didn't vote out to vote was they had put gay marriage initiatives on the ballot. So the people that were more likely to vote Republican but wouldn't vote would turn out to vote against gay marriage. The Democrats had this vote yourself a raise, initiative, and it worked. People turned out and voted to give themselves a raise, and it was kind of smart. The other thing that's interesting is, Florida, there was a huge fight there about the fact that they changed the law so that felons could vote, right? If you were convicted of a felony, you could vote in Florida. And there was a big fight over that. And then there was a fight where the Republicans arranged that if a felon still owed any court costs or fines, they couldn't vote, right? So it was like not every felon could vote. And that was going on. And that was a very strange political battle that took place because, in many U.S. states, if you're convicted of a felony, you cannot vote for the rest of your life. And then in some states you can, and in some states you can, but you have to get like special approval. And that's how it was in Florida. The governor could grant you the right to vote after you'd been convicted of a felony if he felt you were worth it or something, which was very weird. They didn't have to give a reason or anything. And it was just this shameful process where the governor would have like hearings and people would get up and make the case about why they should be able to vote. And he would say, yes, no. And that was that. I mean, it was just really, really an awful, awful thing. And that, when I was in Venezuela, you wouldn't believe this, but, they say Venezuela is not democratic. But not only do felons get to vote in Venezuela, they actually have voting booths in the jails. Because if you have not yet been convicted, if you're awaiting trial, you have the right to vote. So they have a polling place in the jail in Venezuela. So while you're waiting for trial, if you're like, you're waiting to be tried, you can go and vote in the jail. The only people in Venezuela that can't vote are people that are actually serving a sentence. Once you're out, you can vote. And if you're awaiting trial in jail, you even get to vote. And they have a special division of the prison system there that arranges for people in prison who are eligible to vote. I mean, I couldn't believe that. So, but there's so many examples of how undemocratic the U.S. election process is. We have the election on a working Tuesday, right? It's not a national holiday. It's not on a weekend. It's on a Tuesday. So working class people have to be in line all day, before they go to work or after work. The lines are huge in densely populated areas, and densely populated areas tend to be more liberal and left wing. And that's where there's big lines. Whereas if you're in a rural area, it's going to be not as big lines. And then, of course, if people don't have to go to work that day, they can vote anytime during the day. Before work, after work, huge line. Another thing is that, in the U.S. elections, Guam is a U.S. territory. It's not a state. So the people in Guam don't have any say. American Samoa, not a U.S. state territory. Puerto Rico, not a U.S. state. So if you're not in Washington, D.C., not a U.S. state, right? And that all these parts of the country that are not states, they are simply territories, have no representation whatsoever. The electoral college system is bad enough, but there's a whole big chunks of the United States. There's millions of citizens who have no say in who is going to be president. And I mean, imagine if in Russia's election they picked 2 or 3 little territories like Siberia or Russian territories and just said, you know what, these places don't get to vote. There would be mass outrage. We'd say that's undemocratic. The same for Venezuela, if they were to do that. So, in a lot of ways, the USA goes around criticizing different countries for their electoral system when our electoral system is very, very undemocratic.
Yeah.
Right. I think we'll move on. We'll move on to the interview section. We spent quite a bit longer than expected. Are you guys okay with going a little longer than the hour?
Yeah.
David? Okay,
yeah.
Good. I guess we'll go longer than the hour, and we'll finish our next 2 sections. We'll go on to our next section, which we're going to have an interview. We're going to have a few questions for our guest, Caleb Maupin. If you're watching this on YouTube or my Facebook, you can look at the name of the show. And the name of the show is Caleb Maupin on Why Is revolution the main trend in the world today? And I've been listening to Caleb for a while. I want to compare. He's like the back in the day, in a local union in North Carolina. One of their mandates was to have workers read to the truck drivers, and one of the things I like to do is listen to Caleb Maupin. Very insightful, and his lives help inspire me to do lives and get this show started. Interesting community around him. Very promising stuff. And I just like to ask the question that he says at the end of every single one of his lives. Caleb, why is revolution the main trend in the world today?
Well, you have to look at what the word revolution means, because the word revolution is often associated with chaos. People think revolution means people going out and breaking things, or people dying, or a big ugly civil war. But the word revolution, actually, it comes from the word in Latin, revolutio, which just means turn around. And it was like if something spins, it's having a revolution. It's revolving, right? Well, it didn't take on a political connotation until the time that astronomy was developing, and the Catholic Church had long maintained that the Earth was the center of the universe. But Copernicus and later Galileo discovered that that was not the case. The Earth was not the center of the universe. In fact, the Earth is revolving. And so if you were somebody who didn't agree with the feudal order and the aristocracy in the Catholic Church that was saying that the Earth was the center of the universe, but instead believed that the Earth revolved and stood up for scientific truth, you were a revolutionary because you believed the Earth was revolving. That's where the term comes from. And then in England and in France, when forces that were opposed to feudalism, that believed in science and human reason, would rise up and take power, that was called a revolution. You had the French Revolution. I think the first event that was called a revolution was the Glorious Revolution in England. It was a change of power that was actually peaceful. It was called the Glorious Revolution. And then you had the French Revolution. And then revolution, the term revolution became associated with people fighting for human progress and science, and trying to apply human reason to building a more egalitarian and just society. And I think that is the main trend in the world today. I think that around the world where there are people striving for that. I think what China is doing with its Belt and Road Initiative is revolutionary. I think that what is happening with the Bolivarian countries is revolutionary. I think that, all over the United States, as people are getting into socialism and dialectical materialism and kind of trying to understand the way the world works and how we can change it to be more progressive and more rational and more scientific, that is revolutionary. So I would say that what Mao said in 1970, when he said the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, but revolution is the main trend in the world today, I think he's correct, because, it's true, there is a danger of a new world war, right? But that's not a reason to be pessimistic, right? And that there's too much pessimism in the world. I think that people want to look at the negative. They want to look at the dangers of global warming or instability. But when Mao said, yes, the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, but revolution is the main trend in the world today, the main trend is historical progress and advancement to counter the dangers. And I think that's an important observation. And I think that Mao, when he said that, he was arguing against the Soviet leaders. And the Soviet leaders were saying that, the USA has the atomic bomb and there's too much danger of nuclear war. So we should just focus on negotiating détente the United States and put socialism and revolution on the back burner. That was what Khrushchev was saying. And when Mao said the danger of a new world war still exists, he was saying, yes, that's true that there is a danger of nuclear war, but that's not a reason to tell people not to fight for their rights and not to push forward with human progress. And that view pushed by the Khrushchev revisionist leadership of the Soviet Union was incorrect, and that the danger of a new world war was not a reason to put revolution on hold. And so that's why I like to quote that statement. I find it to be very poetic, and I find that often, when you memorize revolutionary phrases and all of that, it can give you a kind of power, when you can kind of learn to recite the words and have them kind of on the tip of your tongue. It can give you kind of a strength that can help you get through difficult situations, It's a technique that many people have used, where they find a key passage of revolutionary teaching or something, and they just put it to exact memory so they can get it right and repeat it to themselves. It's a way to kind of give yourself power to help yourself overcome a difficult situation. So that's a phrase that I put to memory a long time ago, and I've used it for that purpose. So I always end my lives that way.
David, any questions?
Yep. Well, flying from that, let's put the glasses on for a sec. With actually following from that question, I think it's how can we advance revolution in our respective countries?
Oh. Well, I think the main crisis in the United States is an ideological one. I mean, there's many people that are ready to go out and protest. More people are protesting in the United States right now than ever before in my lifetime. And for years, I used to repeat, if only we could get people out there protesting, if only we could build the movement, if only we. And right now, there's plenty of people protesting, but we're not getting any closer to socialism because those protests are not guided by revolutionary ideology, and that we need to hammer out. We need to have the ideological discussions about what went wrong with the Soviet Union. Why did the Soviet Union fall? What has gone wrong within our movement and the confusion? I talk about the synthetic left. I talk about the need for class struggle, and that there are some deep political questions that need to be hammered out within our own movement right now. And we need to struggle for a class struggle, dialectical materialist, scientific socialist approach. And that there's an ideological issue. And that's the primary issue I see in the United States. I haven't been to Australia, but I've heard you say, David, many times that you have the exact same problems over there. Am I correct?
Yes. Yeah, very correct. I mean, we've had that too. A little bit different style compared to the US, but it's pretty much next to the next, pretty much very similar.
Right. So I'll go on to the next question. I'm really borrowing from your ending quote. I was given some really good advice from a friend of mine, Matt Cedillo, who kind of got me into doing interviews. And he said, I asked him, how do you do a good interview? And he said, well, don't ask what you're interested in. Don't ask them like if you got a little detail that's bothering you that you're interested. Ask them something they'll knock out of the park. And I think you did that with the first question. And this one's kind of similar. And I think you went over a little bit on this Friday. Can you give me an example or examples of people waging revolutionary wars to defeat the aggression of the U.S. and their followers?
Oh, well, I mean, there's many examples. There's Vietnam as a classic example, right? And, it's really interesting because, I grew up in a really small town in Ohio, but I was close to some place called Kent State University. And that was where a number of students had gone out to protest the Vietnam War. And the National Guard had been called in, and 4 students were shot down and killed protesting the Vietnam War. And even though I was born long after the Vietnam War was over, in my area, people still remembered that, and it was kind of charred into their minds. And that, when I was a kid, I mean, I had relatives who fought in Vietnam. I actually have relatives whose name are on the Vietnam Memorial. And so, I mean, many of the kids I went to school with, their parents were Vietnam vets. But what was interesting was that, it's not widely admitted in the United States. And there's a lot of movies about the Vietnam War that have been made, but really only one of the movies, Full Metal Jacket, the Stanley Kubrick movie, even dares point this out, because it's just something that is just completely taboo when you talk about the Vietnam War. And Full Metal Jacket hints at it a little bit, right? It doesn't fully come out and say it, but the majority of the fighters in the National Liberation Front of Vietnam were women, right? It was women who fought to free their country. And partly that was because the United States assumed that men would be the fighters, and so men in areas that were considered to be strongholds of the resistance were detained and such. But it was 2/3 of the fighters for the Vietnamese National Liberation Front were women, and that the Vietnamese people, the heroic struggle that they led to drive imperialism out of their country and establish socialism. I mean, that was really amazing. But Korea is another example, right? I mean, the Korean Peninsula. That was the first major defeat the United States had ever suffered. The United States, thought they were going to drive socialism out of the Korean Peninsula. And they were, as soon as China got involved to back their Korean comrades, the United States was very rapidly driven back to the 38th parallel. In North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is the only country in the world to have ever captured a U.S. Army general. And what's also fascinating is 2/3 of the Americans who were captured during the Korean War either became communists or signed statements urging the United States to make an armistice. And that there were like 7,000 U.S. GIs who were captured during the Korean War. And in the POW camps, many of them became convinced that the communists were right. And that drove the Americans crazy. They couldn't understand that. There was this whole brainwashing craze in the United States and movies like The Manchurian Candidate. How can this be happening? This couldn't possibly be happening. How can so many Americans be convinced of the fact that the Korean people have the right to run their own country and that socialism is better than capitalism? So there are many, many examples of countries around the world fighting for their national liberation. I would say probably one of the most important revolutionary wars going on right now is in Yemen. The people of Yemen are fighting to, maintain their independence as a country, to drive the Saudi autocracy out, to start developing their country. And every day they're on the battlefield dying. And the same lie in Vietnam. They said, oh, this isn't the Vietnamese people fighting for their national liberation. This is simply the Soviets. These people are paid by the Soviets. This is a Soviet proxy war. Well, that was not true. Well, in Yemen, they do the same thing. They say, oh, the people of Yemen don't want their independence. This is Iran. This is a proxy war with Iran. Well, that's not true. If this was a proxy war with Iran, it would have been over in 1 week. The Yemeni people since 2015 have been fighting for their national liberation as a country. But you can go to Bahrain. Bahrain has a majority population that are Shia Muslims, but they have a king appointed by the Saudis to rule over them, who is a Sunni and oppresses the Shia majority. And the people of Bahrain, they go out in the streets and they protest. I mean, that's a similar situation there. The people have been in the streets of Chile. There's been revolutionary struggles there. So all over the world, I think there are people that are waging revolutionary wars to defeat the aggression of U.S. imperialists. But I think it's important to point out, though, that never, not in any of those cases that I named, is this what the revolutionaries wanted. They never wanted a war, right? They wanted a peaceful transition to socialism. They wanted to peacefully organize and operate within a democratic process to move towards socialism, that the war was forced on them. In Yemen, a rigged election took place in which only one candidate was on the ballot. The revolutionary forces were forced, into a situation like that. The same in Vietnam, the same in Korea, the same in Bahrain. In all these countries, the revolutionary forces would prefer a peaceful transition and to be able to just peacefully organize. They were forced by the violence of American imperialism and its allies to take up the gun. And that's an important thing, that often you'll get, ultra-left elements that want to just say, oh, violence and killing and guns is so exciting. Well, no, people do that when they have no choice, when they have no other choice. And that's the important thing to remember.
David, any further questions?
Yeah, and just before that, just one comment about Chile. It was very interesting. They voted against the Pinochet-style constitution they had too, so that's a huge step forward for them as well. Look, just following on from what you actually just lightened at the very end there, is how do we deal with ultra-leftism and right opportunism?
Well, when it comes to ultra-leftism, I think the main cure for ultra-leftism is getting people to actually engage with other people about socialism, right? If you sit on the internet and tweet at the world, it's very easy to be very ultra-left. And that's one of the saddest things. This didn't used to happen, but now there are millions of communists in the United States, I'm convinced. Young people in their teens or 20s who are communists have never met another communist in their life, have never gone out and promoted revolutionary ideology, never sold a newspaper, never talked to anybody. And that they kind of just sit on Twitter and it's their kind of alienation. They feel angry at the world, and so they can be on Twitter and they can be the best, most revolutionary sounding communist on Facebook or Twitter. But of course, in that kind of isolation, you're going to develop very ultra left sentiments, right? But when you actually have to go and engage with people with whom you do not agree, people that are hostile to it, and actually make convincing arguments to them and all of that, you're going to shed a lot of your ultra-leftist thinking. I think that engaging with people kind of cures you of your ultra-leftist thinking. For me, I was in an ultra-left Maoist group. That was the first group I was around, was this ultra-left Maoist group. And I remember that what got me to actually start breaking with some of their ultra-left ideas was the fact that they had me selling their newspaper constantly. And I would be out there, selling their paper. And I discovered that it was a far more convincing argument to say to people under socialism, everyone will have a job and everyone will have health care, than, this kind of weird, like, we'll get to a stateless, classless, egalitarian world. But I remember, and I remember saying, well, this is what people want to hear. They want to hear jobs and education and all of that. They don't want to hear, you know, the fulfillment of the ultimate communist vision or some weird philosophical stuff. And I remember that the group then, the older folks in the group said, well, that's economism. You know, we don't want things to get better for U.S. workers. And then I thought, if we don't want things to get better for U.S. workers, what are we doing this for? You know, and that was kind of a weird moment for me. So I think that actually engaging with people, and then in terms of right opportunism, I think the primary form of right opportunism now is people that that think that they can align with American imperialism, you know, and still be an advocate of socialism. I think that they can align with the United States and its latest color revolution or its latest attempt to destabilize a socialist country. They can repeat the smears and slanders against the history of socialism, but yet still be a socialist now. And I think that is the primary form of right opportunism. And at the end of the day, if we're not really opposing American imperialism, we're not really opposing capitalism at home. That the system that is driving our wages down and our living conditions down here in the United States is also the system that oppresses people all over the world. And that while we have to have a local perspective and we have to raise local transitional demands and fight the class struggle locally, it can't be separated from international demands. And that when people try to align their maybe progressive domestic agenda with the imperialist agenda abroad, that is the most dangerous form of right opportunism, and it needs to be exposed.
Thank you.
I'd like, I make a point of highlighting cultural issues. And the reason why I do that is they often use our culture against us. They're trying to get this section of the vote. They're trying to get that section of vote. And they appeal to different populations to suck us into supporting imperialism. I'm getting to that because I kind of want to hear a little bit of the speech you usually give. And can you tell us a little bit of the progressive elements behind the character in the U.S. Superman?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, yeah, Superman. It's very interesting. So it was a comic book. It was first published in 1939, and there were two comic book writers in Cleveland, Ohio, and they wrote this comic of Superman. And his first adventure was to protect a group of coal miners who were on strike. And I think that's pretty neat. Their crooked boss was going to wreck the mine and kill them all in like a mining disaster to stop their union campaign. But Superman, rushed in and saved the day. It's also interesting that, the leader of the American Communist Party at that time was a guy named Earl Browder. And Earl Browder, his nickname was the Man from Kansas. And actually, when he ran for president in 1940, the theme song for his campaign was called The Man from Kansas. So the fact that Superman, is from Kansas, right? He's from Smallville, Kansas, right? That was probably a reference there. And of course, what is Superman's nickname? He's Superman, the Man of Steel. And what is Man of Steel in Russian? Stalin, right? So, he's a man from Kansas like Earl Browder. He's a man of steel like Stalin. He's protecting striking workers. And then during the Second World War, the Superman comic books got so popular, they did a radio version. And in the radio version of Superman, Superman fought the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan, they didn't put Ku Klux Klan in the comic book because it was copyrighted, the names. So they couldn't use the names. They had a group that wore hoods over their faces and burned crosses. They were called the Knights of the Fiery Cross, and that's who Superman fought. And then, interestingly, the FBI started passing the actual secret codes that the Klansmen would use to the Superman writers. And so they started leaking them in the program. And so the Knights of the Fiery Cross would use all the code words and all the passwords that the Ku Klux Klan actually used. And so the Klan, and all around the country, the Klansmen heard their actual secrets and their codes being used on the radio. And it caused them to be humiliated because they all thought they were part of this secret club and no one knew any of their codes. And that actually caused the Ku Klux Klan to kind of fall apart during the Second World War. And it was because of the Superman radio comic. And I think that's pretty neat as well. So, Superman, he's going around fighting fascists. He calls himself a man of steel. He's a man from Kansas. He rescues striking coal miners. Superman, he was a popular front kind of character, right? During the 1930s, the Communist Party had what they called the Popular Front. And it was basically, the idea was that they were going to find the progressive side of Americans and the progressive side of American history and build kind of a popular mobilization, an anti-fascist coalition that the communists would be at the center of. And Superman was very much, if you read the comics, he was the popular front, right? It's justice in the American way, opposing fascism, opposing racism, for the rights of the workers, and Superman, this was the 1930s, 1940s. He's opposing segregation, and he would rant against racism in his comics. That was big in the United States, and that was taboo, and it was a big risk. Back then, no Hollywood movie would dare criticize racism in the United States because of what they called the Jim Crow veto, which is the whole South wouldn't show your movie if that was the case, right? And that they risked the fact that the whole Southern USA might not sell Superman comics if they made those statements. They took the risk anyway. So Superman played a very, very progressive role in American history. And one thing I will add about Superman is if you watch the 1980s Superman movies, they're hokey and silly, Christopher Reeve, but they leave you feeling good. They just leave you with kind of an optimism and a progressivism. And that's there's something special about that, right? It's like the Superman kind of appeals to the goodness in everyone. Lex Luthor is an evil capitalist who owns a big corporation, and he's bald, and he's always maneuvering, to use technology against the people. I say Lex Luthor is basically Jeff Bezos, and Superman is for the common people, maneuvering against this big corporation, this big evil capitalist, and I don't know. I think Superman appeals to the best in people. In one of the 1980s movies, Superman even gets rid of nuclear weapons. He flies around the world and destroys all the nuclear weapons to save people from the danger of nuclear war. So I think Superman is the kind of feeling and the kind of aesthetic and the kind of cultural figure that we should kind of try to get people to understand and identify with socialism. I think that's a strategic way of getting Americans to understand real socialism, is to get them to think about how they feel about Superman and identify it with socialism. Because I think that's honest. I think it's correct.
David, any more questions?
Oh, I've got one more actually, and I guess this all flows from what we've been discussing about so far, and I use this comment too in some of my live chats. I think we all three of us do, but Caleb, I think this one is, what is the important? Can you emphasise the importance of out of the movement and into the masses?
Yeah, well, there's millions of people in the United States who have never met a socialist, never met a communist, have no idea what we believe, right? I was taught in school that communism, I was taught this year after year, like 2-3 years in a row, I was taught that communism means that everyone gets paid the exact same wage, no matter how hard they work. That's what I was taught, right? That the communism is a system where everyone gets paid the exact same wage. That's not true, right? But that's what people are taught, and that's what people believe. That there's a lot of people across the United States who've never met a leftist, never met a socialist, never met a communist, and have no idea what we believe. But then if you add on to that now we have the woke left, right? We have the identity politics crowd. And what they believe is not class struggle politics. And what they believe is often a message that is very hostile, in some cases. If you add that to it, it makes it even more difficult. We need to just get average working class Americans to understand class struggle, socialism, and the need for solidarity against racism, solidarity against all forms of oppression. But we need to get to the masses. And that in a lot of cases, the strategy of the left seems to operate, I think it really comes from the fact that during the 1970s, we had something in the United States called the New Communist Movement. And that was all these 60s radicals. They got jobs in factories, and they tried to bring a communist message to the broad masses of the working class. But at the time, the U.S. standard of living was too high. It was a high standard of living. The economy was going well. And they spent from about 1970 to about 1980 in factories trying to win their coworkers to communism. And it didn't work. And then about 1978, there was the first big major economic downturn since the Second World War. When that happened, there was a feeling like finally among American communists, we can get to our coworkers. But of course, that was the first major downturn since the end of the Second World War. So of course, most American white workers became more right wing because that was what they knew. Things were good back in the 50s. Now they're getting worse. So we're going to go back. And so there was the Reagan reaction. And so after the Reagan reaction, there was a feeling among a lot of American communists that, you know what, it just can't be done. The American working class, they're too conservative, they're too reactionary, and we got to go somewhere else. We got to go into the campuses. We got to go into the labor bureaucracy. Maybe we should only try to organize the urban African American community, but we can't get to the broad masses of the American people because they are just too reactionary. But that's not true anymore. If you look at the number of people who voted for Bernie Sanders, if you look at the polls that are coming out right now, where 30 to 40% of the U.S. public says socialism is better than capitalism, that's not true any longer. You can talk to average Americans about socialism, and it needs to be done. It absolutely needs to be done. And we have to unlearn what was learned in the 70s. It was true back then. Yes, it was true back then that you couldn't reach average Americans. It's not true anymore. The country has changed. The economy has changed. Generations have changed. The Cold War is over. It's time to get out of the protest cage, get out of the movement, and get to the masses, right? Because that's where we need to be. Because if we don't start changing public opinion, we don't start having working class people from average working class families in the United States come to understand that class struggle is the answer, things are only going to get worse. The Trump movement right now is working so hard to just ideologically train its base to think that everything bad is communist. If you notice that was a huge part of the Trump campaign. Joe Biden is communist, right? Communist, communist, communist. Yeah, the Cold War is over, right? But communist, communist, communist. They're doing that. They're trying to train angry working class people who are angry at the elites to think that the elites are all communists, right? They're ahead of us on this, right? They know that it's only a matter of time before the class struggle awakens, and they're ideologically trying to push the working class in the other direction. We got to push back, and we're not going to push back by trying to take over this really small section of U.S. society that's already involved in leftist politics. The way we're going to push back is by getting to the masses, and that's why I'm trying to build the Center for Political Innovation, trying to get good literature out there, trying to have events around the country. We got to get to the masses.
Thank you.
Right on, right on. I just if I could add to that point, like I said earlier, the majority of the people are in favor of ending these wars. They're for healthcare. A lot of people are for education, and neither one of the elite bourgeois parties seems to be offering that to the American people. And we need to be talking with our neighbors and coworkers. And this goes into our next section, which we've been doing every working class revolt. With my co-host David Fox. Last week, I grilled David. I pretended as if I was a right-wing worker, and I said horrible things about socialism. And he told me right up that was not the case. So this week, David, I want you to pretend to be a right-wing worker. I just told you that socialism is the way forward, and let's see what your responses are, and then I'll respond to those.
Yep. We have ways of making you talk, yeah. So.
It's funny. I think there was a segment in the Industrial Workers of the World newspaper that they used to have called Mr. Block. It was like this,
yep.
Right? And yeah. And that in the 70s, one of the communist groups, the Communist Workers' Party, they had a column called The Adventures of Peter the Proletarian, and it was very similar to this. It would be kind of like comic book arguments, so it's kind of interesting. There's a long tradition of this in the socialist movement. So,
well, doesn't socialised healthcare create long queues?
Well, no. I mean, if you look at countries around the world that have adopted a national healthcare system, there are people getting healthcare, and that simply is not the case. And if you look at every other industrial country in the world, other than the United States, provides healthcare to its citizens. And there's different forms of healthcare too. There's single payer, which is what Canada has, where the state is the insurer. There's national healthcare, which is what Britain has. But socialist healthcare is more like what Cuba has, where socialism is part of the healthcare is part of an overall socialist state centrally planned economy. But the reality is, I mean, you look at all the industrial countries around the world, they don't have long queues. People aren't dying. People aren't fleeing to the United States to get healthcare. But it will be a struggle, I would say, to force the bosses to make sure there's enough funding to provide adequate healthcare to everybody. And in Britain, there is a fight right now to defend the national healthcare service.
The right-wing media often will use very misleading stories. They like to use anecdotes. Like, this person didn't get this health care, they had to wait for this. They don't like to show you that the masses of people in France and Europe and Australia, they are routinely given basic health care. They're not forced to go into debt. They're not they're not dying by the tens of thousands like they are in the United States. They'll use anecdotes where this one person didn't get this, and that creates a picture in the mind, and it paints it as evil. They'll also like people will be waiting for a specialist, and they'll take a big line of well, for the American viewers, a queue is a line. Just anybody didn't get that. So they'll take a picture of a long line of waiting for a specific specialist, and they'll act like that's healthcare in general. And it's not. Any response to that yourself, David?
Well, it's interesting because when we're talking about universal healthcare, and that, look, we've got Medicare, which covers the basic costs of your medical costs, going and seeing a doctor's appointment and a few other things. Doesn't cover everything completely, but it's basic form. And obviously, if any people have argued, I've seen the comments on YouTube, not YouTube, on Facebook, where actually from people in the US, they're confusing the universal healthcare is socialism. Well, wrong, because if that was the case, then Australia would be socialist. That by any means. And I think there's a lot of confusion. There is universal healthcare under capitalist system, the British system with a national health system, the Scandinavia, in Germany, France, etc. They've got a form of universal basic coverage for type of medical costs, where when you and I just were talking the other day, I couldn't believe it. If you don't have health insurance in the US, you could be up for not just tens of thousands of dollars, but hundreds of thousands of dollars. That just blew my mind. How could any working class person pay that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm. Right on. Here, let me get this one, Caleb. Go ahead and go and say the next one. David, go ahead with the. Talking point.
Here's a good one. I've come across this before myself. Aren't communists going to take away my house?
No, you're. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. This one's rather common. It's the difference between personal property and capital. Your personal property in most socialist societies, China, Venezuela, you own your toothbrush. No one is going to break in your house and use your toothbrush. Everyone is going to have their, maybe their own housings or their own apartment. That's personal property. What the socialists are talking about taking control of are the oil companies, are the forest. The main centers of economic power, run them in a rational way that makes our lives better, that gives us bigger houses, that gives us better cars, that gives us a better standard of living.
Yeah. Sounds about right. There are some horror stories I've seen in right wing, like Ayn Rand. She told the story of the Bolsheviks forced her family to share their house, but that was in the context of a civil war in which millions of people were dying. So it's a little bit different. But yeah, ultimately, the rate of home ownership in China is actually much higher than the United States. And in Cuba, if you live in the house for, I think, 5 years, it becomes yours. You own it. And in most socialist countries, there's a very high rate of home ownership.
All right, next point, David.
And I've actually, and this is also another one we all come across, especially those of us who have been in the struggle for a long time. Aren't you going to scare people off socialism by using Stalin?
Now, I particularly like this one because when I was trained in Marxist-Leninism, Stalin was the hero of people, and it came from, I was trained by people who were around or had connections to the 1940s, 1930s and 40s, back when the Third International was high. Stalin rebuilt, not rebuilt after the Second World War, but built the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was the most backward country in Europe, basically feudalism. Almost feudalism, semi-feudalism, small industrial working class, changed that to one of the biggest superpowers in the world, electrified the country, gave people hope. There was happiness that people were coming together and doing something with the 5-year plans. And that inspired the communist-led labor movement in the United States to fight for better wages, to get us unemployment insurance, to get us Social Security. This was fights under the Third International that Stalin led. So basically, they say if you want, if you're happy you got a weekend, thank the labor movement, but also thank Stalin for pushing the Third International, inspiring the world.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that there's, that's an important point. Everything you said there is absolutely correct, right? That Stalin was the leader of the USSR at a time it became a superpower and had huge economic achievements, that he led a global communist movement that won huge victories. I mean, there wouldn't be a civil rights movement if it weren't for Stalin. Let's not forget about that. Stalin, and the Communist Party USA raised the issue of segregation and opposed racism, in the United States, and at a key time in U.S. history when no other party would touch that. But I also want to tell people, look, I wasn't there, and I don't know if every person that was convicted of a crime, or everyone agrees that a lot of bad things happened in the Great Terror, and that a lot of people who went to Gulag shouldn't have been there, and that I'm not interested in defending one particular leader and saying that they did nothing wrong. I'm interested in pointing to the actual facts about how successful socialism has been. Right, and that the Soviet Union was under horrendous conditions. It was a country that had been invaded, and millions of people died, and 15 countries invaded them after the Russian Revolution. But yet they were able to get out of those dire circumstances and become the first country to launch spacecraft, and defeat the Nazis, and have so many astounding achievements. That points to the success of socialism as a system. But does that mean that everything that one leader did is necessarily good or bad? Not necessarily, and we don't really know. We weren't there. But overwhelmingly, though, there's a reason that people like Albert Einstein would praise Stalin, right? There's a reason that at the time the Grapes of Wrath was published, that John Steinbeck was praising Stalin. There's a reason that during World War II there were Hollywood movies that showed Stalin in a positive light. That at the time Stalin was alive, he was identified with a lot of very, very progressive things that people around the world were fighting for. So, there's been a huge effort to try and, demonize Stalin and such, but that doesn't mean that that's the whole story necessarily.
Was there any more points on that, David?
No, I think that's
all. That's all.
Yeah.
Anything you'd like to raise, Caleb?
No, I really can't think of anything, but it's been really a pleasure to come on here. You guys have a great program, Working Class Revolt. This is great stuff. I like it.
All right.
Just before we go, I'd like to show you this. This came out in the early 2000s. This is around the time we had the big marches against both war in Afghanistan and Iraq, and we had two people from the U.S. Labor movement came out to Australia to visit the respective unions. A lot of unions were against the wars at that time, and there was mass mobilisations. I don't know if I can see it, but that's the badge.
Huh.
I don't know, just getting into focus. I don't know if you can focus that, but basically, yeah, there it is. Make jobs, not war. Don't push. And it's US Labor against the war. So there you go. It's to say that both US and Australian comrades and friends, and there's a little history there as well. So and recognise that.
That's particularly interesting with all these people in the Bush administration getting behind Biden. I recently shared I'm a big fan of music. I shared Green Day, American Idiot was like it was the anti-war song of our generation. And it said F America in it. And I thought it was the greatest thing ever. But it also appealed to people's sentiments and ideas of the time. And it's really shown a transformation. If you look back at American Idiot was like the feeling, like fuck Bush and his wars. We're tired of this. And now through Obama and through propaganda and media, they have convinced the masses of oppressed people and working class people that oppose Bush to line up behind Biden in the coming wars. And it's scary. Any thoughts on that, Caleb?
Well, I think that shows that our work is cut out for us, right? And that politics has really changed. I remember when I was protesting the war in Iraq when I first got started. It was interesting because at that point the ruling class seemed very thoroughly united, almost, right, behind that war. and that the left, we were just kind of this isolated group. You know, and the left were people who listen to Democracy Now! And Amy Goodman, and they march against wars, and they're on college campuses and they play drums, and they're just kind of this irrelevant fringe that you just kind of have to tolerate. But now U.S. society is in a crisis, and the ruling class are at each other's throats, and so there's a need to build mass movements to back up one section of the ruling class against another. And that we have, the left is like newly energized, but the politics have been widely distorted as it's like, kind of being used by one section of the ruling class against another. And that the political landscape has really, really evolved and changed. And I think that we have lost a lot of ideological ground at the same time that interest in socialist and revolutionary politics has really expanded. So the work that the Center for Political Innovation is trying to do by bringing back this kind of class struggle, historical and dialectical materialist message, and the kind of things we've been talking about here is very, very important because in the time when I was first getting involved, we didn't have very much of a movement, but the movement that was there was much more ideologically together. Now we have a lot of people interested in socialism, but not much ideological coherence and a huge amount of ideological confusion. So, I think it's one way or the other. We just have our work to do. I mean, we have a job to do to spread the revolutionary message and to correct the problems of our times. And that's really all we can do.
So what is CPI?
Well, it's a think tank, the Center for Political Innovation. And we've published a couple books. We've been convening web conferences. Our next web conference is going to be November 21st, a week from today. And in fact, Dust James, I believe you're one of the speakers at that web conference, and so it'll be great to have you there. And it's about trying to develop an organization that'll put out kind of a class struggle revolutionary message, wrangle with the big questions in the history of Marxism. I say we should study all of the revolutionaries of the past, but blindly follow none of them. And we should just kind of engage with these ideas and get a revolutionary class struggle socialist message to the broad masses of people. And that's the purpose of the Center for Political Innovation. And there's a huge amount of interest. It's really a growing thing, and publish books, have conferences, have events, very exciting stuff.
How would someone get involved with the CPI?
Well, we have our web conferences, but you can also send me an email, calebmaupin@gmail.com, my first name, my last name @gmail.com. Send me an email, and I'll try my best to plug you in.
I'd love to be plugged.
But we went a little bit over schedule. I want to thank everybody for joining us. 8 o'clock next week, David, 8 p.m. our time. All right.
So it's 8 p.m., which would be 12 o'clock our time here. It's 16-hour difference at the moment.
All right. Thanks, Caleb and David and all. Everyone have a good night.